Hello, everybody online. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the fifth and final in our series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Action Week. Today, we are excited to have a talk by Sean Yardley on aquatic invasive species, ballast water, and biofouling. So to give a bit of an introduction, Sean is an aquatic science technician working at Fisheries and Oceans Canada in Burlington, Ontario. He holds an undergrad degree in environmental studies from the University of Windsor and a Master of Environmental Science from the University of Guelph. Sean has over 10 years of experience in the field of aquatic research, monitoring, and assessment with focuses on aquatic invasive species, resource management, biodiversity monitoring, and anthropogenic stressor effects. Sean has worked in Dr. Sarah Bailey's lab for the last 3 years, researching the efficacy of ballast water treatment systems to minimize aquatic invasive species introductions to Canada. With that, I'll pass things over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Johanna. And yeah, I want to first start by thanking everyone for taking the time out of your lunch hour today to listen to me talk. I know my colleagues and I believe this work is very important, so it's always nice for us to get the opportunity to give a talk about what we're working on, especially to the public or whoever may be listening today. So yeah, we'll get started. The title of my presentation here is Ships, Ballast Water, Biofouling, and Introduction of Aquatic Invasive Species. So just for context there, when I'm talking about ships throughout the presentation, these are the types of ships that I'm referring to, whether it be tankers or cargo ships. The idea is that they're large ships. So moving on, first, I thought it important to define a couple terms. So I'd like to quickly define what a biological introduction is. So a biological introduction is when any species is introduced outside of their natural range. So typically species will be found in a habitat that's suitable for them and meets all their requirements to feed and reproduce. And when those species are picked up and introduced to another area, that's what we call a biological introduction. And there are many human activities that rapidly move species around the globe. So these introductions can either be deliberate or accidental. So I've included a few pictures on the bottom of this screen there to give a couple different examples of these types of introduction. So if you look on the left there, you'll see someone squatting down and dumping their what looks like an aquarium into a pond or a river. And this would be an example of a deliberate or unauthorized introduction. So for example, people often go out and they'll buy a goldfish or whatever from the pet store, and they'll have it for a few years, and then for whatever reason, they can't care for it anymore. And often with the best intentions in mind, but not really realizing what the impacts will be, they'll just take it down to a local pond and dump it in there. And if that happens a few times or even once, there's the possibility for an established introduction in that way. Another way would be stalking, and this would be a deliberate introduction. So this middle photo here, you can see kind of a bunch of fish being fired out of a hose into a pond. And kind of an example that some people may be familiar with this would be the grass carp introduction in the United States. They were introduced to ponds as a form of vegetation control, and then eventually a large enough rain event happens and the ponds or berms overflow, and then those carp were released into kind of an uncontrolled environment where they were able to spread throughout a system and obviously in that case cause quite a bit of damage. And then an example of an accidental introduction would be fouled equipment. So you can see in this photo here, there's like a large buoy with a bunch of barnacles or growth on the bottom of it. And kind of the way this introduction would work is this buoy is picked up from one water body. Maybe it's not cleaned entirely or properly enough, and then it's dumped into another body of water, and then all those organisms can start to release and be introduced to that environment. And maybe a more relatable example of that to the general public would be maybe you have a boat up at your cottage that sits in your lake, and as it sits there for a while, all the algae and plant and animal life begins to attach to the hull. And then you may want to go to another lake in a different area, and if you don't clean the hull of your boat properly or your trailer, there's definitely the potential for an introduction in that way as well. And introductions can involve any live organisms down to the smallest plankton. So that's what our lab in particular is looking at, is phytoplankton and zooplankton introductions. But just for a broader context, it can include kind of any species, whether it be aquatic or in other instances, terrestrial species as well. So there's a couple different terms that are used interchangeably to describe invasive species. For the sake of this presentation, I'll be using the term non-indigenous species, or NIS. So if you see that acronym, I'm just referring to that, but other terms that are commonly used would be non-native, exotic, alien, or introduced species. I'm sure there are others, but those are the most common ones that I've come across. And then it's important to kind of make the distinction between an NIS and then an NIS that's considered an invasive species. So what makes a species invasive is its ability to rapidly reproduce in a system and then spread quickly and impact that system in whatever way they do. Next slide. Why do introductions matter? So NIS may negatively impact ecosystems and can have severe economic costs. So aside from kind of the impact to the ecology of a system or the habitat of a system, there are also often economic impacts. And one estimate has the cost of 6 aquatic invasive species being around $298 to $776 million a year. And that can either be in lost revenue or in money spent trying to eradicate, prevent, or just mitigate the impacts of an invasive species. So I have 4 examples here. There are many other ways that NIS can impact the environment that they're introduced to, but these are kind of 4 good examples. The first being predation. So if you look to the bottom there, I have a picture of the emerald ash borer as an example of predation. So basically they were introduced and they'll feed and burrow into ash trees, which eventually kill them. And kind of an interesting statistic for that, or a statistic that can show you the impact that these species can have, is that 8 to 10 years after a beetle arrives, they can kill 99% of the ash trees in an area. So moving forward, another example would be the zebra mussel, and this would be an example of competition. So zebra mussels, which were introduced via ballast water, are voracious filter feeders, and they're able to quickly reproduce and spread. So as the number of zebra mussels in an area increases, they're obviously going to filter out that plankton out of the water, and they're going to be taking those resources away from native mussel species, which eventually can't compete, and they kind of drift away and become eradicated from an area as the zebra mussel takes over. Third, we have an example of parasitism, which is the sea lamprey, which is kind of a mean-looking creature here, but during their parasitic phase, they'll kind of emerge and be in the lake system, and then they use their teeth there to kind of latch on to fish, and they have a burrowing tongue that goes in where they kind of pull blood and essentially energy from the fish. And to kind of show you how dangerous, I guess, for lack of a better term, they can be, is a single lamprey can destroy an average of 18 kilograms of fish in its parasitic phase, and as few as 1 in 7 fish can survive a sea lamprey attack. And then fourth and finally for this presentation, we have the habitat change. An example of that would be water chestnut. So the water chestnut, which was originally native to Europe, Asia, and Africa, is an ornamental water garden plant, and it forms very dense floating mats that can shade out native species. So essentially they form these very dense mats. No sunlight is able to penetrate through to the lake bed or wherever, and then natural or vegetation that otherwise would have normally been able to grow there doesn't have what they need to grow. And then on top of that, there's the reduced ability for recreational activities such as boating and swimming. So the impacts of NIS is kind of really wide ranging in terms of the damage that they can do to a system. And then also NIS are the leading cause of animal extinctions globally. And the major problem with them is once they're introduced, it's almost impossible to completely eradicate them from the system that they've found themselves in. So this slide here, I just have a quick figure. It's titled the Global Pathways of Introduction. And on the bottom axis here, we have years. So the data kind of spans from 1965 all the way through 2015. And this shows the number of aquatic NIS detections. So for this figure, I'd like to kind of focus on the green and the yellow lines here because that relates to what our lab is looking at here, which is transport via ballast water and transport via ship fouling. So as you can see here, it starts out fairly low from 1965 and then starts to increase around 1990. And the reason that we see this increase in the graph is because monitoring efforts and kind of invasive species awareness probably wasn't top of mind or top of priority from 1965 through till 1990, which is when we saw kind of an increase in monitoring and awareness. So as you look more for invasive species, you're likely to find more, which is why we see the lines kind of trending up here until about the mid 2000s, we start to see a decline. And that actually coincides with when some ballast water regulations were implemented. So it's nice to see a dip there that coincides with regulations, which could be evidence that the regulations are working the way we intended them to. But the main takeaway from this slide is that ballast water is the most likely pathway for greater than 70% of introductions since 1965. And that's why our lab spends so much time and effort specifically looking at shipping industry as a pathway of introduction. So moving on, for maybe people who don't know, I thought it important to define exactly what ballast water is or what ballast is. So ballast refers to any heavy materials or substance like rocks or water that are placed in the lower part of a ship to help maintain stability and balance. And the overarching idea is that as ballast water is pumped from the water surrounding the ship, organisms are pulled into the intake and then discharged into the ballast tanks inside of the ship. And this diagram here at the top, if you look, kind of describes that process. So a ship will be at its port, which we'll call its source port, and they'll often be discharging cargo or unloading their cargo. And as that weight comes off the ship starts to rise a little bit higher in the water. So to maintain stability and an even level in the water, they'll start to pump ballast in as kind of a counterweight. And like I said before, as they pump that water in, all the organisms that are in that environment end up in the ballast tanks. So then you can see here on the second part, the ship will be in transit with no cargo and potentially full ballast tanks. And all the organisms will just be in here kind of hanging out and doing their thing. And then eventually when they get to the port that they intended to get to, they'll start loading cargo. So as the cargo gets loaded, the ship starts to sink lower in the water. And then to kind of balance that and give it a bit more buoyancy, they'll start to just discharge the ballast, which has all the organisms from the initial port, and dump them into a new port. And another kind of mechanism that, or pathway, or I guess it's a mechanism of transport from one area to another, would be residual ballast. So I guess anyone who has a bilge pump in their own personal boat or even a sump pump in your house knows that you can run a pump on the floor as long as you want, but there's always going to be a little bit of water left over. It's almost impossible to get every last drop out, and ballast water tanks are no exception in that way. So there's always going to be a little bit of sediment and water hanging out in the bottom here that allows organisms to survive and persist from one port to another, where eventually they, or potentially they could be stirred up and then discharged into another environment. So another term that I introduced a little bit earlier is biofouling. So biofouling is when organisms that can be plants, animals, or algae build up on structures exposed to aquatic environments. So the structures that we're particularly interested in are the ship's hulls. So I've included this diagram here that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of the different types of surface areas that we'll see on a ship hull. And kind of what's interesting about that is different communities of organisms can attach to different areas. So for example, the anchor chain has a lot of nooks and crannies and it's kind of in and out of the water, versus something like the sea chest crate, which also has a lot of little areas that organisms can affix themselves to, but it's under the water all the time, versus something like the main hull, which is a very, wouldn't say a smooth surface, but smoother surface that's often painted with anti-fouling paint. And it also experiences things like friction as water kind of moves over the surface. So what we're looking at is all these different areas of the ship and kind of the different types of communities or organisms that may persist on different areas as it travels from port to port. And the interesting thing about biofouling versus ballast water is biofouling is kind of a continual add-on to the ship as it goes from port to port, whereas ballast water is typically dumped in and out, and you kind of get a big group of organisms from one environment dumped to another. Whereas with biofouling, a ship may start at one port where a few organisms may attach. They'll ride with the ship to the next port where a few more organisms will attach, and it kind of just adds up over time. And eventually you have a ship hull with potentially organisms from a bunch of different environments that could work their way to Canada and then become released. So I've also just included a couple photos here of kind of the types of fouling and what it may look like. So you can see the bottom left, we'll have different barnacles, algae, worms, shrimps, amphipods, crabs, all different types of things can kind of attach to the hull and hitch a ride to wherever they may be going to next. So as I mentioned earlier in that graph, there were some regulations introduced in kind of the mid 2000s. So I thought I'd go over those really quickly because we do believe that they have been successful. So it's kind of good to highlight when regulations have the intended effect. So the first one was for ballast water exchange for full tanks, which began in Great Lakes as a voluntary measure in 1989 and became mandatory in the US in 1993. And with ballast water exchange, we've done some shipboard testing and saw as much of a reduction as 99% in freshwater zooplankton, which is fairly effective. And then another interesting statistic is that 5 NIS that were introduced before 1999 would not have survived a ballast water exchange. So had that regulation been implemented earlier, we would have seen more success or less introductions, so to speak. And then the national mandatory requirements for ballast water exchange in Canada were implemented in 2006. So just to quickly describe what ballast water exchange is, essentially there'll be a source port where the ballast water is loaded. And this is typically in, let's say, a nearshore port environment with a certain community of organisms there that are well suited to that environment. Then what happens is, say it's a transatlantic journey. Once they're out in kind of the deep ocean, they'll discharge all that ballast water from the source port, and those organisms are not likely to survive out there because of the change of habitat. And then they'll fill the tanks with deep ocean water, again with another set of organisms that may not persist in a nearshore environment. And then when they get to their new port, when they discharge their ballast, it is that deep ocean water with the organisms that are not likely to survive in a nearshore port environment. And another regulation is regarding saltwater flushing. And if you think back to the slide I presented earlier describing the residual ballast water, that's why this particular regulation was introduced. And saltwater flushing is essentially just flushing your tanks out with mid-ocean water to reduce the number of living invertebrates in the residual ballast water. And kind of one mechanism or one way this would work is if you had freshwater organisms and then you flush with salt water, you would introduce something called osmotic stress, which essentially would kill all the freshwater organisms or a large percentage of the freshwater organisms. But the overall takeaway from this is that as it currently sits, there should be no untreated ballast water entering the Great Lakes. And also worth mentioning is that there is new technologies for treating ballast water systems that we're currently assessing, systems that use things like UV filtration and chlorine treatment to kind of disinfect the water, so to speak, or kill all of the organisms that are in there. And there's likely to be those types of regulations introduced in the near future, which we think will have a lot of success, hopefully. And then this slide here is just to give everyone an idea of the extent and kind of the scale of the global shipping industry. So the picture or the image that I've included here is similar to what you may see, I guess, if you're an air traffic controller directing planes, except this version is from a website called Marine Traffic, which just tracks different ships around the world. So each one of these dots here represents a ship. So as you can see, there's a lot going on around the world all the time, and all the ports are very interconnected, which means that organisms from basically anywhere in the world can end up anywhere else in a very short time frame. So some of the statistics around the shipping industry is that there's greater than 93,000 ships worldwide, and about 3.5 billion tons of ballast water are moved by ships annually, which is the equivalent to about 1.4 million Olympic swimming pools for context. So there's a lot of ships moving a lot of water all the time, 24/7, and there's definitely a lot of potential for organisms to be introduced to areas all over the world. And as the shipping industry continues to grow, as the world becomes more globalized and kind of the need for more trade and more cargo transport arises, we're going to see ships with increasing size and speed. So more ballast water, more hull fouling area, and then quicker trips across the globe. So that's going to pose an increased risk to NIS introductions in the future. And then they're also going to be traveling to new locations around the world as we continue to extract resources and as shipping lanes kind of begin to open up around the world, which I can touch on in this next slide here. So climate change and ocean transport. So from this figure here and kind of the body of literature, we can see that sea surface temperatures are increasing over the 20th century and they continue to rise. And as it pertains to the shipping industry specifically, we look to see Arctic sea ice extent decreasing dramatically over time. So you can see in this image here, we have some Arctic sea ice imagery from 1979. And then if you fast forward to 2015, that same area, you can see quite a bit less sea ice coverage. And the implication for this in the shipping industry is that more shipping lanes are going to open up as sea ice decreases or goes away. And then as the shipping season gets extended, because there's less time of full freeze in that area, we're going to see more trips. So there's going to be different routes and more trips, which is going to result in the potential for more introduction events of NIS and just an overall greater invasion risk as we move forward and things continue to warm. So this slide here, I've just kind of included or added some of what we currently know about NIS in the Arctic. So the rate of discovery of NIS in the Arctic ranged from 0 to 4 species per year between 1960 and 2015. Within that time frame, we saw 54 introduction events, but only 38 of them had known origins. But of those 38 known origins, 39% of them were transferred by vessel, which makes up the vast majority of introductions. So that's, again, why we spend so much time studying NIS introductions and shipping as a pathway for those introductions. So what's interesting is the ability of NIS to survive after introductions is an area of current research. And the idea here is that climate projections are suggesting that NIS may be more likely to colonize Arctic waters as sea temperature increases. So as things continue to increase and we start to see more species introduced from southern latitudes that otherwise may not have survived in harsh Arctic conditions, as those conditions slightly start to warm, we may start to see more and more organisms that are able to persist in the Arctic environment. So this is kind of an area of research that we're interested in. And there's also implications of things like sea ice as well on hull fouling, which I personally find kind of interesting. So there's kind of two avenues which it could go down. You could look at sea ice scraping biofouling off the hulls, maybe negatively impacting fouling organisms. However, it also could be a mechanism for the more release of organisms. So these are the types of questions and things that we're looking into specifically in the Arctic environment now and in the future. So this is kind of my last slide here. I just have a couple of quick take-home messages. So NIS can have major long-lasting ecological and economic impacts on the receiving environment. So kind of my message, I guess, in this is that regulations are important in this situation, and they have been shown to be effective. But it's important to work with the shipping industry when creating these regulations to find a good balance between protecting our environment and our resources, but still allowing the shipping industry to move things in the way that they need to and not getting in their way as much as possible. So second, we have shipping, including ballast water and biofouling, is the largest contributor of NIS introductions to Canada. So again, just reiterating why our lab spends so much time specifically studying shipping, ballast water, and biofouling as a means of introduction to Canada. And then obviously the third and final take-home message is that climate change is expected to increase the risk and potential impacts of NIS introductions to the Arctic, so that the Arctic is a particularly sensitive environment that requires further research, and we're excited to be doing that research now and in the future. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate you listening to my talk. I would just like to quickly give some acknowledgements to Dr. Sarah Bailey and Dr. Oscar Cassis-Monroy, who have been working on this type of work for far longer than me. So they've definitely laid good groundwork, and also like to give credit to all the Bailey Lab members, past and present, for their work. It really is like a continual building blocks year over year. So it takes quite a few people to do this work, and I feel it necessary to give them acknowledgement. So thank you, and thank you, Johanna, for inviting me into this presentation. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean, for that great talk. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone online did as well. And now we've got lots of time for folks to ask their questions. So for those online, you can put your questions into either the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll go over as many as people have. So there is one here. It says, on the marine traffic map, there are no shipping recorded for the Canadian Arctic. Are they being monitored elsewhere? And do they have the obligation to use a tracking device?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm trying to think back to when that screenshot was taken. The reason you may not see ships in the Arctic there may have to do with time of year, if they're shipping during that time of year. And as far as my understanding of when they're required to have that tracking on, I don't know if, like, by law they're required to. We have seen some instances where ships will turn their tracking devices off for whatever reason. But typically the ships that we're looking at to do sampling on, they generally have the tracking system on, so we can see them. But yeah, no, I did notice that as well. Like, generally, I think there is less shipping going on in the Arctic. There's not as much as, say, the routes kind of transoceanic across the Atlantic. So maybe that's why. But yeah, it could also have to do with time of year as well that image was taken.
Makes sense. Another question, is there a risk of introduction from ships coming from Quebec?
I would say yes, just because I mentioned before things like hull fouling. So just because it's in Quebec doesn't mean that it wasn't somewhere else before that. So you may have organisms that attached on in some other country, and then they work their way to Quebec, and then from Quebec they may come down here to Ontario or up to the Arctic. So there's always that risk of residual ballast water and hull fouling as well. So I would say yes, but specifically from Quebec, I would kind of need to look at what organisms are in that environment, and then the environment that they're going to make any kind of educated answer to that question.
Perfect. Another question, would eDNA or eRNA be a good way to monitor for aquatic invasive species? And maybe you can just describe what that means.
Yeah, so eDNA is environmental eDNA, and kind of how I've had it described to me in the past, which was a good kind of mental image, is if you imagine a bus driving down a dirt road and kicking up dust, the DNA from an organism essentially sheds as it moves through the water, so it'll leave traces of DNA, which we can then take water samples, do a filtration process, and then kind of get an idea of which organisms may be in that environment. We are looking into using eDNA technology as a means of monitoring to check for presence and absence of certain species in water. However, it is an emerging technology, so we're kind of now just kind of figuring out how we can apply that technology and kind of what its limitations are in terms of ballast water research. But it definitely is a tool that we're looking into. My boss in particular, Dr. Oscar Cassis-Monroy, is looking into eDNA as a type of monitoring. So we're not there yet, but it is a technology that we hope to use in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of talk around eDNA and its applications, but also its limitations.
Yep. So
So
it's,
it's
as
an
with any
evolving
new
field.
emerging science, yeah, it's always
Mm-hmm.
figuring out how you can use it and what its limitations are. So.
Mm-hmm. Another question, what species should we be aware of for monitoring in the Arctic?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I'm hesitate to give an answer there because I'm not a taxonomist. So typically, like as a technician here, I'm not identifying species in that way. I'm kind of staining organisms and counting the amount of live or dead organisms. So to give you a particular species to look out for, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth and say anything, but yeah, I guess that's what I would say to that. My boss may be on this call and he may have some ideas as to particular species to look out for in the Arctic, but yeah, I'd hesitate to give an answer on that just with my knowledge base for that particular
Okay.
question.
If your boss is on the line, I can unmute them.
Yeah, if he's in
But
there,
I
it's Oscar.
no, I don't see Oscar. Too
He
bad.
didn't join then. Sorry, I can't answer that question.
That's okay. We will, yeah, hold on to that question. Yeah, it's a good one. Those are the last of the questions I see. I'll check the Q&A. Oh, no, there's another one here. Okay. NIS introductions into Arctic marine waterways is certainly a real concern. You mentioned research. What specific invasive species research is underway or planned in the NWT or none of it?
I can't say for NWT. We do have work planned in Baffin Island to work at a mine up there just to assess kind of how or which NIS species may be introduced there and what the particular risk is to the Arctic environment. I know we're looking, like I said, at things like biofouling and kind of the implications of specific Arctic environments on biofouling. So things like sea ice scraping, and obviously climate change. So as things begin to warm in that area, we're looking to see what species may be the first ones that are able to colonize the Arctic as you see that slight warming. And then we're also looking at things like I said, the niche hull areas. So different colonies of different organisms on certain parts of the hull may be different. So we're looking to see things like sea ice scraping and what species may be kind of more likely to be dislodged and survive in Arctic environments in that way. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you on things specific to NWT, but we are looking at Baffin Island as kind of an area of research specifically because there's a mine up there with so many ships coming in and out. It's going to provide us a lot of opportunity to collect samples there. So.
Great. Another question. What would be adequate mitigation measures to implement to avoid introduction?
I guess I would have to ask a follow-up question in which context? In context of the shipping industry or like within the context of maybe like personal boating and moving from one area to another? I can give kind of examples of each. Like specifically
Mhm.
with the work that I used to do in consulting, we used to travel quite a bit from province to province, often bringing the same equipment with us. So we would always have to do some kind of a decontamination on things like our gill nets, waders, or whatever type of sampling equipment that we use. So I guess the like kind of a general answer to that question would be just to be aware when you're moving things from one body of water to another, whether it's fishing bait, whether it's your boat, and then obviously in the context of the shipping industry, we're looking at ballast water and hull fouling as well. So I would say just be aware when you're moving anything from one body of water to another, you may need to decontaminate that water in some type of way because there's always the risk of an organism from one environment jumping to another and hitching a ride on anything basically. So
Mhm. Yeah, I will just use that as a segue to plug. With our council, we promote the campaign Clean Drain Dry. And so if folks are moving their boats around, even between lakes, depending on where you are, there's always a risk of carrying an invasive species from one lake into another. And so between moving your boats or any type of aquatic gear in between different water bodies, making sure that that gear or watercraft is cleaned, drained, and then dried for an adequate amount of time to get rid of any aquatic invasive species that may be on the watercraft or gear.
and I'd follow up to that and say that just overall awareness, because awareness of invasive species week, like being aware and maybe you see something in an environment that shouldn't be there, like people may now know that, okay, maybe this shouldn't be in here. Maybe I should report this to someone. So I'd say an overall awareness is probably one of the most effective things, because if people care about it, then and they know about it, then we can take action and kind of prevent these types of things. So definitely awareness for sure is a good answer to that question.
Yeah, that's another great segue for me to promote. Just that we are putting up some educational signage at the park we have between at the Alberta NWT border, which will remind folks of things like clean, drain, dry, and stuff that they can be doing as they're moving into the NWT to make sure that they're not bringing in any aquatic invasive species or other invasive species. So yeah, definitely there's that outreach education component in trying to boost public awareness of these kinds of issues.
Absolutely.
All right, let me just check Q&A for any other questions. I'm not seeing any more. So unless anyone wants to very quickly throw something in the chat or Q&A, I will just say thank you again, Sean, for a great presentation and for answering all those questions. That
Thank
was
you.
really great.
Those are good
And
questions. I appreciate it.
yeah, agreed. I'm glad that people are interested. So thank you as well to everyone in the audience, everyone online for joining us today. This is the last of our webinars for National Invasive Species Action Week, but if you missed some of the webinars earlier in the week, these talks were recorded and will be shortly available on our YouTube channel. So you can keep an eye on our website or Facebook page to hear about when those videos will be going live. Our website is nwtkisp.ca, that's nwtcispp.ca, or you can look us up, the NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens on Facebook. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Sean, and hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you.
Right, thanks. Take care.